a NATO ally warns that the transatlantic alliance could collapse. Not because of Russia, not because of China, but because of the United States. That sounds unthinkable. Yet, this is exactly what is happening over Greenland. I'm Fareed Zakaria. And when Donald Trump says America may need to take control of Greenland, even hinting at military options, this is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a stress test for the world's most powerful alliance. An island of ice, 56,000 people, owned by Denmark, a loyal NATO member, and suddenly it becomes a geopolitical fault line. Trump says this is about national security, about Russian ships, Chinese ships, about the Arctic becoming the next strategic frontier. But here is the deeper question you should be asking. What happens when security logic begins to override alliance rules? Stay with me, because Greenland is not the story. The future of NATO is, let's slow the picture down and name the problem clearly. This is not a dispute about territory. It is a clash between two ideas of security. On one side, Denmark and Greenland see security as rules-based. Borders matter, consent matters. Alliances are built on trust and law. On the other side, Donald Trump is advancing a far older idea: security as control, security as dominance over space. From that perspective, Greenland is not Danish. It is not Greenlandic. It is strategic real estate in a rapidly changing Arctic. As ice melts, new sea lanes emerge. As tensions rise, the Arctic shifts from a buffer zone to a front line. And suddenly, geography feels destiny again. This is why Trump frames Greenland as a need, not a choice, and why Denmark hears that language as an existential threat. Because if security can override sovereignty here, it can do so anywhere. This is where a local dispute becomes a systemic crisis. To see how we reach this moment, we need to go back into history and into the logic of power that never really disappeared. To understand why Greenland keeps resurfacing in moments of global tension, we have to rewind the clock far back. Greenland may look peripheral, but history treats it differently. Because in every major conflict of the modern era, distance has never meant irrelevance. For centuries, Greenland was a Danish colony, remote, poor, largely ignored. Then World War II rewrote its fate. When Nazi Germany occupied Denmark, the United States moved in, not out of conquest, but necessity. Airfields, radio stations, Arctic access. What mattered was not who lived there, but where it sat. After the war, the Americans stayed. Pituffik Space Base once truly became a permanent fixture, a listening post, a shield against Soviet missiles crossing the polar route. In 1951, a defense agreement quietly formalized this reality. Denmark retained sovereignty. The US retained strategic depth. This balance worked for decades. But balances depend on stability. Now add climate change. Melting ice, opening routes, renewed great power rivalry. What once was frozen insurance is becoming active terrain. And history tells us this. When geography wakes up, politics follows. Which brings us to the first moment when this long dormant tension finally broke into the open. To understand why Greenland keeps resurfacing in moments of global tension, we have to rewind the clock far back. Greenland may look peripheral, but history treats it differently. Because in every major conflict of the modern era, distance has never meant irrelevance. For centuries, Greenland was a Danish colony, remote, poor, largely ignored. Then World War II rewrote its fate. When Nazi Germany occupied Denmark, the United States moved in, not out of conquest, but necessity. Airfields, radio stations, Arctic access. What mattered was not who lived there, but where it sat. After the war, the Americans stayed. Pituffik Space Base once Thule became a permanent fixture, a listening post, a shield against Soviet missiles crossing the polar route. In 1951, a defense agreement quietly formalized this reality. Denmark retained sovereignty. The US retained strategic depth. This balance worked for decades. But balances depend on stability. Now add climate change. Melting ice, opening routes, renewed great power rivalry. What once was frozen insurance is becoming active terrain. And history tells us this. When geography wakes up, politics follows. Which brings us to the first moment when this long dormant tension finally broke into the open. To see the real engine behind this crisis, we have to strip away the headlines. Trump says this is not about minerals, not about money, only about security. And on the surface, that sounds plausible. Greenland sits astride the Arctic routes that Russian missiles would cross. It hosts a critical US space and missile defense base. And as the Arctic opens, it becomes harder to monitor and easier to contest. But here is the hidden mechanism at work. Security thinking has shifted from collective defense to positional control, from alliances to assets. In that mindset, legal status becomes secondary. What matters is who can deny access to whom. Trump points to Russian and Chinese ships near Greenland, not because they dominate the region, but because they signal competition. And competition changes behavior. Once a territory is framed as a vulnerability, pressure follows. Once pressure is normalized, coercion becomes thinkable. This is how systems slide quietly from cooperation to confrontation. Denmark hears a partner asking for reassurance. Washington hears exposure demanding action. Same facts, different logics. And when logics diverge inside an alliance, the consequences do not stay contained. They spill outward into people's lives, into elections, into the fragile trust that holds NATO together. That spillover is what we confront next. The second rupture did not come from Washington alone. It came from symbolism. In March, the US Vice President flew to Greenland, not quietly, not diplomatically, but to deliver a message. J.D. Vance stood on Greenlandic soil and accused Denmark of failing to protect the territory, failing to invest, failing to take security seriously. For Copenhagen, this was extraordinary. For Greenlanders, it felt intrusive because criticism is one thing, but questioning stewardship is another. Then came the next move, a special envoy, Jeff Landry. His mission was not technical, it was political, and his language was unmistakable. Greenland, he suggested, should become American. By late 2025, what once sounded speculative now looked systematic. Visit, accuse, appoint, pressure. None of this involved force, yet all of it carried weight. This is how power is exercised in the modern world, not with invasion, but with inevitability. And for Greenland's people, the message was clear. Decisions were being discussed about them, not with them. That is when geopolitics stops being abstract. It becomes personal. Now let's bring this down from strategy to skin and bone, because geopolitics always sounds clean until it lands on you. If you live in Greenland, this is not a theory. It is your home, your land, your future. You hear powerful men debating your fate as if you were an asset on a balance sheet, as if sovereignty were optional, as if consent were a technicality. You hear the phrase again and again, national security. But whose security? Most Greenlanders support independence from Denmark one day. That is their aspiration. But becoming American, that idea is overwhelmingly rejected because independence is about dignity. Annexation feels like erasure. A tour operator calls the idea dangerous. A former prime minister says it plainly. He's treating us like something he can buy. If you were in their place, you would feel the same unease. Not fear, but anger. And this is where power often miscalculates. It assumes geography obeys. That people adapt, they don't. If this story matters to you, pause for a moment, share it, because the voices most affected are the ones least heard. And when people feel ignored, the consequences never stay local. They ripple outward across borders, across alliances, across the world. What happens in Greenland does not stop in the Arctic, because NATO is not just a military pact. It is a promise that disputes between allies are resolved through rules, not pressure, through consent, not coercion. When that promise is strained, everyone notices Denmark is not a minor player. It is a founding NATO member. Its warning that an attempt to take Greenland would end the transatlantic alliance was not rhetoric. It was alarm, and other allies heard it. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain. They stood together and said something unusually direct. Greenland belongs to its people. This was not about geography. It was about precedent. If a powerful ally can override a smaller one in the name of security, then NATO's internal logic fractures. Trust erodes. Coordination weakens. And adversaries watch carefully. Russia does not need to challenge NATO militarily if NATO undermines itself. China does not need bases if alliances lose cohesion. This is how global power shifts today, not through dramatic conquest, but through subtle misalignment. A crack here, a doubt there, and soon a system built on unity begins to question its own foundation. Which brings us to the hardest question of all. Where does this path lead next? So let's look forward calmly, analytically, at the futures now on the table. There are three. The first is restraint. The United States pulls back from coercive language. Greenland remains Danish, semi-autonomous, but cooperation deepens. More US investment, more joint security. The alliance bends but holds. This is the least dramatic outcome, and historically the rarest. The second is drift, no annexation, no invasion, just pressure without resolution. Greenland becomes a permanent bargaining chip. Denmark absorbs the strain. NATO functions, but with less trust, less warmth, less certainty. Alliances can survive this state, but they decay quietly inside it. The third scenario is rupture. The US treats security as override. Denmark resists. Legal norms collide with raw power. Even without force, the damage would be severe. Because once an alliance member believes sovereignty is conditional, the alliance is no longer equal. This is the paradox of power. The stronger you are, the more disciplined restraint requires. History shows us this. Empires fall not when they lack strength, but when they stop listening. And that brings us to the final question. Not what America can do, but what it should do. So we end where every serious geopolitical story must end with choice. Power always presents options, but wisdom determines which ones are taken. The United States does not need Greenland to be strong. It already has access. It already has bases. It already has allies. What it risks losing is something far harder to rebuild: trust. Alliances are not enforced by force. They survive on restraint, on the belief that strength will be exercised with care. If Greenland becomes a test case where security overrides consent, the message to the world is clear. Rules apply until they don't. And once that belief takes hold, every alliance becomes transactional, temporary, fragile. The Arctic will matter more in the years ahead. So will China. So will Russia. But the decisive factor will not be geography. It will be credibility. If this analysis helped you see the system beneath the headlines, share it. These questions affect more than diplomats. They shape the world you live in. And in the next chapter, we'll ask the harder question still. What happens when America's allies start planning for a future without certainty? That is a conversation worth continuing.